Hi everyone, and welcome to the T-Tech Go session for IBM TRIRIGA version 3.5. My name is Venice Enid, and I'm one of the platform developers for the IBM TRIRIGA product. Today we will be going through the globalization aspect of the new user experience framework, or UX for short. We will be covering the following topics such as the new process of globalizing UX applications, the new dictionary storage where the system stores static and translatable text from the UX views. We will also talk about what comprises a translatable text and talk on two new caches available in the administrator console. We will also discuss configurations relating to internal value and localized value in the data source model. And later on, we can see some tips on troubleshooting globalization issues on UX framework. Then see a short demo on translated UX view and some new tools that we will be covering in the session. So globalizing UX applications. The new UX framework has a new process of translating the views to the user. In this framework, the platform generates a translated version of the HTML file for non-US English users. So when a non-US English user requests a static HTML resource from the server, the platform first scans the base HTML file and parses translatable text from it. Then create a translated version of that HTML file by replacing with translated text. It then stores it to a file cache before pushes it back to the user's browser. So as you can see here, we have an example of our base UX view HTML file with a translatable text here, the My Assessment. So when a non-US English user would request this page, the platform then generate or create a translated version of that page and store it somewhere. So as you can see it here. So in this framework, it assumes that the view files in your web view metadata records are actually the base view files and are written for US English users. But for the translated version of that file for the non-US English user, you can see that we have added a language attribute in the HTML, in the generated HTML file, and also added that language information into the URL, as you can see here. Similarly with BiDi languages, we also added support for that in the body of the HTML through this dir or direction attribute. Right, dictionary. It's a new storage that we introduced in this release, which stores unique translatable static text. And this may be used in other areas or features of the product in the future, but for now, it is primarily being used to hold static text parsed from the UX views. So each unique translatable text is represented as TRIRIGA record of the dictionary entry business object, which we commonly call as dictionary entry. This new BO, which is under System module, is included in the 3.5 upgrade. So how does platform generate these dictionary entries based from the UX views? It is done when an admin user exports labels from the Globalization Manager. We have enhanced the export tool to support exporting dictionary entries. And during the export process, it parses all the UX views and TRIRIGA components in the system to find translatable text in the file. then create or update dictionary records as needed. After which it exports the dictionary records to our standard XLIF format. As we will see later, we have added a dictionary type under the label drop-down of the export tool. So existing features of this tool is also applicable to dictionary labels, like doing full versus delta export, exporting translated labels, and etc. So after exporting dictionary entries, you can then provide translations to them and import them back to the system through the existing import tool of the Globalization Manager. We have enhanced that tool to support these type of labels. So you should see a new dictionary file included in our label language path. So when a dictionary entry is imported to the system, platform will create new dictionary record or update existing one if available for that language. For example, you are importing translation of My Assessments dictionary entry in Italian. A platform will create a new dictionary record with language ID of that Italian. So please note that these dictionary records are different from the instance data translation, as we know, because they are not being stored in one record, but rather separate records. In other words, one dictionary record represents one language, so there will be record for the base, which is US English, which was created during export, and one for Italian, which is generated during import, and another record, say, for French, if you're importing a French dictionary entry. Since these dictionary entries are records, or TRIRIGA records, and can be imported through object migration or OM tool, we do not recommend doing so from the OM tool, as it may likely create duplicate dictionary records, because the TRI dictionary entry BO is using control number field as its record name mapping. So there is no guarantee that it will find a match in the target environment. But if you do import them through the OM tool, make sure to remove existing dictionary records before importing through OM. And to prevent these issues, we highly recommend use the Globalization Manager to manage the dictionary entries. All right, so what is translatable text? It is a static label or message found in the UX view that is meant to be displayed to a user and should be translated for non-US English users. So where can platform find and parse translatable text? So translatable text can be found from a value of known attributes of HTML elements, those global attributes, or custom attributes coming from the Polymer elements, or even from the custom TRIRIGA components. So it can also be parsed from the text nodes of these elements. It can also be an HTML markup when it is defined inside a paragraph or P or span elements. So why are we parsing HTML markups as translatable text? Well, this is mainly to support concatenated text and ability to style certain text within the concatenated text. For example, in a paragraph or P element, a developer may need to highlight certain text in the paragraph. So in this case, the platform needs to send the full inner HTML of the paragraph element, which will include the B or the bold element, for example, so that it will not lose its context or meaning. So we cannot send pieces of information as separate translatable text, but rather we want the whole thing to be sent to translation. So translatable text can also be found from a JavaScript variable or variables inside a script tag or script element. Let me pull in one of the UX articles to see some examples of these translatable text sources. So in here, you will see that here are the supported attributes that the parser, the UX view parser, will attempt to find translatable text. So for any element, either the HTML5, Polymer, or our own TRIRIGA components, if there is a value inside the out attribute, description, error message, label, placeholder, etc., the value of this attribute will be pulled in as a translatable text, will be parsed by our UX view parser. So an example here, you see a label. So area, you've seen it highlighted or in bold, that means it's considered as translatable text. And another example is the error message of a paper input Polymer element, which would have this invalid input value as a translatable text. So another to note here is any custom attribute. Custom would mean that any attribute that which name ends with dash label will also be considered. So as an example, in one of our TRIRIGA components, the TriComp audit header, the back label attribute will be considered as its value as translatable text. Same with the action dash label, because it ends with a dash label. So an example for the text nodes are here, like for example in this div element, what the parser does, it will consider each text node, because if it has a multiple text nodes in an element, it will consider it as an individual translatable text and not the concatenated text. So for example, div, it finds that there is a text node IBM TRIRIGA, that would be one translatable text, and another one as application. So there will be two separate translatable texts in that element. So we say here, except for inner tags P and span, and the known list of inner tags here at the bottom, because these are only considered, they will be considered when they are inside a P or a span. So if they are not inside a P or a span, the inner HTML will be considered for those inner tags. So for example, B is considered as one of the inner tags here. So because it's not inside a P or a span, the inner HTML, which is actually this full thing here inside the element, would be considered as translatable text. So move planning in this case, or if you have a header, the projects, etc. But if they are inside a P or a span, they won't be considered as having an individual translatable text, but they will be pulled in as that whole part of the P or the span inner HTML. So for example, here we have a paragraph. This whole piece will be considered as translatable text. So we are not, the parser will not be sending this don't as an individual translatable text, but it will send this whole thing. So same thing with the span. So another area where the parser will look for translatable text is within the script tag or script element. So anything that is named variable that is named like this, that would start with double underscore before dictionary and double underscore after the dictionary name will be considered its value as translatable text. So as an example here, you have a dictionary 1, 2, and then the value of those variables will be considered as translatable text. All right, let me go back to the presentation. So conditions. There are conditions to meet when parsing translatable text from the UX view. And let me go back to that article to show an example of those. All right, so if element does not have a translate attribute, or if it has it, the value must be yes, otherwise the UX view parser will skip it. So for example, normally or usually you would have an element, a defined element there that does not have translate attribute. But in some cases where you know this shouldn't be translated and you wouldn't want translator to even consider translating it, you could put in a translate attribute equals to no in your element, and the UX view parser will gonna skip it. So that translate attribute rule is only applicable per element. So meaning that if you have a translate equals to no in a div element, for example, then it only pertains to the text nodes or attributes of that div element and will not apply to each child element. So for example here we had the div element here, and if you are to say I don't want to translate IBM TRIRIGA, you would want to put in translate equals to no on the div element. So that translate equals to no is only applicable to the IBM TRIRIGA translatable text. So meaning the parser will gonna skip it because the translate is equal to no, but it will not skip the child element B, which is bold element within the div element. So it would still consider move planning as translatable text within that context. So similarly, because application, as example, is a text node under the div, and div has a translate equals to no, then the application will not be considered as translatable text. Right. So another condition is that text must have at least one alphabetic character. So example here, so even if you have 1, 2, 3, but you have an A in there, it will consider it as translatable text if it's found in one of those sources of elements and attributes. And last condition would be that if you do have a data binders in your elements, especially with polymer elements, polymer components, I mean, you would usually see this as to represent dynamic data at runtime. So if you have a data binder, it must have at least one alphabetic character outside of that binder. So for example, here we have this span element here, and we know span, we grab the full inner HTML And it does see that there is a binder, a data binder, but it knows that, okay, there are other alphabetic characters outside of the data binder. So it will send in this full inner HTML. So let's say it's not, this thing is not inside a span. Let's say this is a div. Let's say, for instance, that this span is replaced with a div. Then this inner span would now be checked that, okay, in the inner HTML of this span has a pure data binder. So it will not send this, it will not consider that as the translatable text because it's a pure data binder. Okay, let me go back to the slides. So keep in mind that even if UX View Parser is able to find translatable text from the views and create dictionary entry record, the export tool of Globalization Manager may not export it if it falls under the exclusion list of this existing configuration file. So you might be familiar with this exclusion list text, which can be found in the user files. So if you see scenario where, okay, I really need this dictionary entry to be exported to the XLib file. So what you probably want to do is check your exclusion list. Yeah, it got excluded by default. Well, you can leave that exclusion or the rule in the exclusion list, but you can override it by adding the particular translatable text inside the inclusion list text. All right, for performance. Aside from the user's web browser capability to cache static contents, including the translated UX view files, the platform is also enhanced to add these two caches to improve performance. So in order to minimize parsing, then translating, and then loading of translated UX view files to the user's web browser, the translated view files are cached to the user files folder of your TRIRIGA installation. So the platform will reuse these cached translated view files in succeeding requests from the user's web browser. So you will notice that when the files were translated and stored into the user files folder, you will see a UX folder, and then it will be divided into subfolders like components and views. So components, you would expect to see TRIRIGA platform components in there, the translated version of those files, and you will see the UX application view files under the views folder. So they are organized inside of those folders. They will be organized by language ID, the TRIRIGA language ID of those users. And you would see naming convention. It's using actually the web view metadata record ID as a name for that translated file. And this type of cache will be refreshed every time TRIRIGA server is started, or every after importing label language path. So similarly, dictionary cached is created in order to cache the dictionary entries retrieved from the database. So it's a similar cached mechanism we used for like the object metadata. And it also get refreshed after importing the label language path. Admin user can also manually refresh these caches from the cache manager. Just to note that even if these caches were automatically refreshed after importing a label language pack that may include a dictionary file, user's browser cache may have still the stale views or stale translated views after refreshing these caches. So in order for the system to regenerate and reload those translated view files to the user's web browser, users need to refresh their browser caches. And similarly, if the customer would manually update the dictionary records, they will need to do a manual refresh of these caches, then have their user refresh the browser cache. So internal data or localized data. So when are we going to use internal versus localized? So by default, when you add a data source field to your model record, the default configuration of that flag is the localized value, because it is assumed that this data source field or the data of this source field will be shown to the user and will be used in the view for user interaction. So when do you not use the localized value of the data source field? So you will disable the localized value if the data is used to compare against the static text in the JavaScript conditional logic. So for example, you have a classification status field and you have a logic in your JavaScript that would check for the value of that particular classification. If it's active, you do something, and if not, then you show something to the user. So in that case where you use it to compare a static text in your condition, then you have to use the internal value, because that would be consistent to all your users. So in order to do that, you would have to check a flag somewhere in your data source field to indicate that you are disabling the localized value for this field. So one thing to note is that when you're comparing values of data source fields, not really static text, but you're comparing against each data source fields, then make sure that their types are compatible. For example, you're comparing an internal value data source field to another internal value data source field, or you are comparing a localized data source field to another localized data source field. Because if they're not the same, then you might get an inconsistent result in your condition. So here are some troubleshooting tips that you can use if you encounter globalization issues on your UX application. So for example, if you're seeing that your view is not translating properly, like you're expecting your updated dictionary translation or entry and it's not showing up in your view, then try refreshing these caches. So the translated file cache, dictionary file cache, and finally your user browser cache. So if you see that your UX application is not working, meaning the logic is not working, like when you are creating a certain record and it's not working only for user that is non-US English, then try opening the browser's developer tool and check if there are console errors. Sometimes the translated string or text of your dictionary entry may have a special characters that will make the JavaScript or the HTML file invalid. So if you can find that, and if it's showing in the console errors, then you can try fixing or updating the translation for that dictionary entry, and then refresh the caches as mentioned above. So another thing you can do for this scenario is to check the data source field types when comparing data values into your HTML or JavaScript logic. So remember in the previous slide we talked about internal versus the localized values, so make sure that they're compatible, and if you are indeed comparing it with static text, then make sure you're using internal value. One thing that I will show later is on how to troubleshoot translated view is to enable mock view. Take note that this is only an internal tool and it's not really meant to be a supported tool. So this is only used for troubleshooting. I will show that later. And lastly is you can check our existing logs, the label manager and translation data logs, just to make sure if there are errors related to dictionary entries. All right, so let's see this in action. Let me bring in my browser. Okay, let me log in as my US English user, which is our base user for UX framework. So as you can see, this is these are composed of HTML files that were created by developers and are stored in our web view metadata records. So they're all written in US English and expected to be shown to US English user. Now let me log in as my Italian user. So as you've noticed, I did not clear any cache when I switched from English user to Italian user. So that's something new for UX framework. You can switch different language users without clearing your browser cache. So let's inspect this page. So if you look at above here in HTML element, you will see the lang attribute that I mentioned earlier, which would carry what the user's language information is. So this is the language code and the country code of that Italian user. And because it's not a BiDi language, the direction in the body element is left to right. But depending on your user's profile, if it's meant to have an right to left direction, then you should expect to see an RTL in this case. All right, so what you can also check is in the sources or in the network. You will see that these sources here, or resources, static resources, have that language information on the URL itself. So there's an IT dash capital IT in the URL. What this would mean is the browser can actually cache this translated Italian version of the static resource. And I'm going to show you next where the file cache is located when the translated view is created for that static resource. So in your installation folder, you're familiar with user files, you should expect to see a UX folder in there. And if you expand that, you will see components and views. And components, because that particular page is using TRIRIGA component, so you should see this TRIRIGA component translated version of that file, of the component file. Similarly with your views, so for that particular application, there are UX application views being used, so they're being translated as well in here. And these are the record IDs of those web view metadata records. So let's take an example here. Right, so you should see this one in the screenshot earlier. This is the translated version of that view file. So let me show you what has been changed in the Globalization Manager. So if we log into the TRIRIGA application, so under Tools at Globalization Manager, the export page or tool now has that dictionary label type in the drop down. So you can pick that and just export dictionary entries. So similarly with the import, nothing has really changed in the UI for the import, but it does, support this existing features in there for the dictionary file. Okay, so next let me show you an example of a dictionary file, which you will see inside a label language pack. So this is the Italian dictionary file. So you should see or expect that the TRIRIGA element type will have the dictionary. And next, let me show you the administrator console. So under Cache Manager, you should see those two new caches that we added for this release, the translated UX file cache and the translated dictionary cache. So next I'm going to show you that internal tool I mentioned in the troubleshooting slide, how to enable mock view. And keep in mind it's only used for troubleshooting your UX view file to make sure that as you develop your HTML file, you can quickly test if the elements or the labels, the static labels and messages you have added to your HTML files will come up or will be exported later or will be translated. So let me go back to our initial page. So in here, if you have enabled this view, you can see this option, mocked view. You can slide that and enable it, and then go to your application and you should see that your page is showing the mocked string. So you will see that it will be within this particular string, mock at the beginning, and there's another mock at the end. So this will tell you that this page, the static labels or messages in my page will be translated later. So as you export labels in Globalization Manager, you should expect these strings or text to be inside the dictionary file. So in order to get to that mock view slider on your main page, because by default this particular page is not accessible, so what you need to do is to enable it from your TRIRIGA web properties and set this particular property into this file. So that would be the web underscore dev underscore config underscore enabled equals to true. But you might want to take it out when you're in production use. So only use this when you're in development mode. So lastly, let me show you an example of a data source field metadata record that would allow you to disable the localized data of a certain data source field. So in here, as an example, in the space assessment application, there is one field in there that is meant to show or return the internal value, which is the one stored in the T table. So if you can see here, this one's checked, and that's actually the disable localized value column. So when that one is checked, then the platform will return the internal value of that field. So if we open that particular data source field metadata record, you should also see that the disable localized value flag is checked. And by default, when you add fields into this data source metadata record, this flag will be unchecked by default. That wraps up our demo for today, and let me go back to the presentation. So for your reference, get to Service Management Connect SMC, and I have added here a link to the UX articles that I have shown you earlier. There will be other articles related to UX framework in there as well. So visit us in there and get in touch with us in the forums as well. And thank you so much for attending or looking at this presentation. I hope this will be a good and valuable information to you. Thank you.